Yeah, it's pretty awful.
Yeah.
Very awful.
And most of the workmen that might come into your house aren't vaccinated. That age people don't believe
Right.
it.
Right.
They think they're immortal.
Well, they're stupid.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I just don't let them in. I say
Yeah.
no.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You ask them if they've been vaccinated, Rabbi, or what do you do?
I do.
Yeah.
I do.
Why? Yeah,
And
you're entitled
they-
to ask that.
And
Sure.
if they tell me they're not, I say to them, I'm sorry, you can't work here.
Yeah.
So
So they reported 1.5 million cases today
That's all.
in the U.S. Well,
Yeah.
that's a lot.
Yeah.
Does anybody have this thing that just popped up? This meeting is being live streamed?
yes, yeah, just got it.
It's on
They got it.
you're on YouTube now.
Oh,
Be careful what you say about somebody.
right.
Because they can't answer back.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, one of the things
but you
that-
may be banned for life.
Right.
They said that
You want to wait a little bit after 7, Rabbi? Give some people a chance to.
Yeah, we can give it another couple minutes.
Okay. All right.
Hi,
Give me
Paula.
the word when you're ready to go.
Okay.
Paula, you're muted.
No, everybody's going to have to be muted when the rabbi starts, obviously.
Yeah,
so.
I know.
Well, one of the interesting things I heard was that the hospital statistics are less terrible than you think they are because they're testing everybody that comes in. So a lot of the ones that are positive are not primarily COVID patients.
Right. They're there
People
for
that came
something
for
else.
something else, and then they tested positive. So
Oh,
Yeah.
that not everybody's very sick from COVID that's in the hospital, I
Right.
guess.
Right. Hey, Marilyn.
Hey, why are they going to the hospital then if they're
For
not?
something else.
So we're
Something
there
else.
for other reasons.
Pregnancy.
Like say they went for surgery and they tested them before they went in and they tested positive,
Mhm,
but they admitted them and did whatever they needed to do.
okay.
Do they keep them in a COVID ward?
Yes, they have to separate them. Once
They do.
they've found that they have it, in fact, that was one of the problems. I was reading the same thing, Gusty. And separate rooms.
Hi, Jane. You're upside down. Oh, there she is.
there
Okay.
she is.
I thought you were standing on your head.
Hi, Jane.
Hi, everybody. Can anybody hear me?
Yes,
let's-
we can,
Yes.
Michael.
Yes, we can.
Okay, because before we could hear you, we couldn't hear you, then we could hear you, and then you couldn't hear us. So we're up and running, I guess.
You're good.
Your, your voice is delayed
Thank
from
you.
your picture, though.
Say again, Dick?
Your voice is delayed from your video.
Oh, well,
Well,
I'm
that's-
gonna mute anyway.
That's
That's
because,
signal.
that's simply because
And we're gonna.
your signal may be weak.
Signal's
Probably have a
straight.
weak signal. Yeah.
It is 7:00.
Yep. We'll go one more minute and see who
Okay.
else.
Rabbi, I have a question for you. Are you gonna
Okay.
do Jewish gangsters?
Next month.
Thank God. Okay.
We were looking forward to that.
Next month. Jewish gangsters.
Good.
Would you come in?
All right, I'm going to put the rabbi on speaker, and everybody, please mute yourselves.
Okay. Well, good evening, everyone. Hope all of you are well. Those of you who I've been able to see look like you're fundamentally well and in good health, and your well-being is secure. When I thought about this topic, I thought about it almost immediately when I was putting together an adult education program. But when I thought about it, it seemed to me that there was difficult finding a starting point for this topic. Are Jews white and does it matter? So the short answer to both of those questions is no and no. But I don't know that you'll walk away satisfied for adult education if I just say that. So let me go on and give you a little more depth and fill in some of the ideas that I've been thinking about when it comes to this topic. I thought that the best place to start would be the Bible, as it often is in many cases, the best place to begin. There is a word that appears, at least to the best of my knowledge, only 2 times in the Bible. Once in the book of Numbers, and once in the book of Amos. And I want to look at it to begin this topic, not only for what it meant in ancient days, but also for what it might mean today, because I believe that whether or how we use this word says a lot about us as individuals, as well as about the people that we call by this word. So in the book of Numbers, there's a very brief and cryptic sentence. It says, and I quote, Miriam and Aaron gossiped about Moses and the Cushite woman whom he married. So the question becomes, what does that mean? Did Moses marry another woman in addition to his already wife Zipporah, the daughter of the Midianite priest Jethro? We learned about her in the book of Exodus. And if so, why does the Torah never mention this second wife? And what does it mean that they gossiped about this second wife? Does it mean that they complained that she was black? The sages of the Midrash understand this verse in a very different way. They say there was no second wife. They say that they gossiped about Zipporah because they felt her pain. They say that from the time Moses became the leader of the Israelite people, he was so busy with the community and with communal affairs that he had no time for her. He had no time for Zipporah. And so Miriam and Aaron, Moses' siblings, spoke up on her behalf and tried to persuade Moses to pay attention to her. And why is she called the Cushite? Which literally means a black person, because she felt so badly at being neglected that her face turned dark from depression. So that's what some of the sages say. Am I right in saying that if you read this passage the way the sages do, there is no put down here? There's no criticism here. There is no claim that Moses' wife was of less value because she was a Cushite. And if you read the passage as the sages do, blackness refers to the wife of refers to the wife of Moses' mood and not the color of her skin. So that's the first time that the word Cushite, black, appears in the Bible, in the book of Numbers. Now, let me show you the second place in the Torah where the word Cushite is found. The prophet Amos rebukes the people of Israel for their arrogance and their false pride. He says to them, do you think that you're so special just because God took you out of Egypt? How are you any different to me than the Cushite? I took you out of Egypt, and I took them out of Kaftor. Now that's a pretty striking statement. You are no different in God's sight than the Cushites are, and therefore you should not boast. It's true that God took you out of Egyptian slavery, but God has taken many people out of slavery, and so you should not hold yourself up as better than anybody else. So here we have two biblical passages in which the word Cushite or black is found, and neither one is found to be derogatory or an insulting term. On the contrary, the meaning of the term in Amos is that all people are equal, and all people are entitled to dignity, and all people are entitled to respect. Now, let me ask you for a moment an embarrassing question. When you were growing up, what did the word Cushi mean where you were growing up? The answer, at least from where I came from in Connecticut, is that it was a derogatory term that was used to describe Black people. It was an insulting term to describe people whom we believe were rude and crude or ignorant and who tended to be criminals, people who we wanted nothing to do with. The word Cushi literally only meant black, but the word black in English, it was an insulting term and one that at least my parents told me not to use. So with this as background, I want to talk to you for a moment about a cultural revolution that has taken place in Israel in recent years. When Israel was created, an enormous number of Jews left Arab countries in which they had lived for many centuries, and they made their way to Israel. They came from Morocco, and they came from Yemen, and they came from Libya, and they came from Egypt, and they came from Iran, and they come from Iraq, and from other Muslim countries. And when they arrived in Israel, they experienced cultural shock. And so did the Israelis who met them. These Eastern Jews, as they're still called today, when you hear the term Mizrahi or Mizrahim, they're referring to Jews of the Eastern countries of Arab descent. They had never seen many of the things that Western Jews had taken for granted. They had never seen an airplane. They had no idea how to fix or even how to drive a car. They didn't know about the great books of the Western world. They'd never heard of Karl Marx. So how are they supposed to understand the things like the principles of the kibbutz movement, which were based on Marx's philosophy? And perhaps the biggest difference was that the Eastern Jews, these Mizrahim, were pious, and the Western Jews, for the most part, were secularists. And so for the first years of the state, these two communities lived side by side, but they had very, very little in common. A child who came from the East was looked down upon in the schools that were run by the Jews of the West. And can you guess what these kids were called by their classmates? They had dark skin, and so they were called by the Western Jews Kushim. And the word was meant to be just as demeaning and just as insulting as words like Schwarze or Blackie here in America. So that's the first thing that I need for you to understand about the difference in, or the variation in, Jews between the East and the West. When I was coming of age, the well-intentioned would say, I don't see race, to signal that they didn't judge people by the color of their skin. The problem with that approach was that if you didn't see race, you ignored part of what made an individual unique, and societally, you risked overlooking historic inequities that are grounded in race. Perhaps the meaning of these words, spoken by the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. on April 28, 1963, at the Lincoln Memorial, was misconstrued. He said, I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. King certainly was not saying to overlook race, but to look beyond race when judging people, and instead focused on the values that guide their lives. So this brings me to, are Jews white? Well, as a friend of mine in Israel used to say, a tour guide used to say, when he was posed with a particularly difficult question, he would thoughtfully look at the person and he would say, you know, it's complicated. There was an article that was published in the Atlanta Jewish News in, I think it was December of 2016. It was called, Are Jews White? It's Complicated. And month after month, I've come to understand, since that column was published, that column is ranked among the most viewed items of the Atlanta Jewish Times website. It attracted the second most page views in all of 2020 and 2021. And from time to time, I wonder whether some of those who are pulling it up online are using it and using its contents to justify their anti-Semitism. Rereading that column and taking into consideration all that has transpired, it seems to me that it's important to think about that question. I suspect that more of us are aware of and personally acquainted with Jews of color, a catch-all that by varying definitions includes African Americans, Latinos, Asians, Sephardim, Mizrahim that I spoke about earlier, though not all of them may identify as such. Estimates of this population range from 12 to 15% in a May 2019 study by researchers from Stanford University and the University of San Francisco, to a 6% cited in a 2013 Pew Research Center report. Whatever the figure, The phrase highlights for American Jews and non-Jews alike the diversity in a community that's too often and too easily stereotyped as white and or basically Ashkenazi. Now, if you were to look at a story that's been told by playwright Alfred Urey, whose Atlanta trilogy, Driving Miss Daisy, Last Night at Ballyhoo, and Parade deals with issues of assimilation, anti-Semitism, and racism. Growing up in Atlanta in the 1940s, Urey was told, "We're not white, we're Jewish." Urey said much the same when he was a keynote speaker sponsored by the Bremen Museum, the Southern Jewish Historical Society, and the Temple in Atlanta. He said, "We Jews are not quite white, not like the echelon we want to be in. And Black people certainly weren't white, so we were all kind of other," he told his audience. "I am white and of Ashkenazi descent. I don't pretend to know what goes through the mind of an African American when the police car passes by or when they feel suspicious eyes on them as they walk in a store. Nor did I have the talk with my sons, as many Black parents do, about how to handle interactions with the police. Without venturing into the fraught worlds of wokeness and intersectionality, these are realities experienced by a minority of Jews in America, but from which the majority are spared." That newspaper article, "Are Jews White? It's Complicated," was written several months before Charlottesville, Virginia, where the khaki-clad tiki torch carrying mob chanted, "Jews will not replace us." But the white nationalists, white supremacists, and other breeds of bigots can look at a Jew of color and, without knowing their religion, hate them first for the color of their skin. The Jewish community has always been an active voice in multi-religious, multiracial, multi-ethnic choruses, calling attention to incidents in which African Americans have been killed in questionable circumstances by police, and in some instances by civilians acting in an extrajudicial fashion. The Jewish community today is engaged in self-examination and discussion about the role that race plays in the synagogue, in schools, and in other communal institutions. Atlanta is home to numerous clergy, groups, and individuals working in that space. Now, having given you that so far, let me talk for a moment about censuses and how we determine how many of whom there is in a community. There is a book of wisdom in the Jewish community called the Wisdom of Nachmanides. And one of the quotes from the Wisdom of Nachmanides says, the most important purpose of a census is to impress upon each of us the value and the sterling worth of our soul. The census is not for census takers. It's for those being counted so that they know they matter to someone. We, as a Jewish community, have had Jewish community censuses taken ever since the book of Exodus in the Torah. And over the generations, we've had various moments to develop new perspectives that sometimes resulted in expanding the Jewish people. We saw this in the book of Bamidbar, when the daughters of Zelophehad petitioned God and Moses for the right of women to be counted as a part of the community. And they were. We see a similar opportunity with a rather new report that was commissioned to answer two simple questions. How many Jews of color are there in the United States? And in the coming decades, how many Jews of color will there be? The project began with an attempt to obtain reliable accounting of Jews of color here in the United States. And yet, when the research team began systematically examining Jewish population studies and the means by which these studies collected data on American Jews in the past, they found population studies with persistent shortcomings, resulting in Jews of color being undercounted, being miscounted, and finally, being not counted at all. This dearth of reliable findings has surprised us. For all of our efforts to count United States Jews and all that we know about American Jews through the numerous population studies that we've taken, nationally and locally, we learned that we know very little, almost nothing, about the internal racial and ethnic diversity of the American Jewish community. So how did we find ourselves in a situation where the data we have doesn't fully capture who we are as United States Jews? Well, the answer is pretty simple. So far, population studies designed by and for a Jewish community that largely expresses as white have generally neglected to ask systemic and reliable questions about race and ethnicity. And as a result, there are numerous important studies that contain either inconsistent data on the racial and ethnic identities of American Jews, which is very problematic when trying to compare one study to another, or in the aforementioned undercounting of Jews of color in general. But even with the challenging data and the undercount, there seems to be at least a glimmer of good news. We estimate in 2021 that of the United States' 7.2 million Jews, at least 12 to 15%, just over 1 million Jews, are Jews of color. It's about 1 in 7. And that's probably an undercount. We learned that in some communities, at least 20% of Jewish households are multiracial. We also know that the demographics of the United States Jewish community trends along the same lines as the larger United States community in which we exist, helping us to see that in some decades from now, we too may be a majority of people of color. Our United States Jewish community is larger than we know, than we can see, than we can imagine. And this moment can be a catalyst to connect and embrace the whole of our Jewish community. But there's a little more good news, I think. The findings of this report wouldn't exist if not for the work that informs our report and that gives us insights to refine our understandings of American Jewry in the future. And let's be real for a moment. Writing and implementing population studies is a tremendously important and complicated undertaking, especially when trying to study American Jews. One big reason is that the United States largely operates in constructed, neat, and tidy racial categories, with people of color falling into the groups of non-white Hispanic or Latinx, Black or African American, American Indian, Alaskan Native, Asian, Native Hawaiian, or other Pacific Islander, and multiracial. And Jews as a part of the United States race construct doesn't always elegantly fit in to those borders. For example, the United States Census counts those from the Middle East as white. What does that mean when trying to racially categorize Mizrahi Jews, those Eastern Jews that I talked about earlier? The work of conducting community studies is hard, it's complex, and it's not neat and tidy and doesn't always fit into simple parameters. And still the question of who counts, both who gets counted and who does the counting in American Jewish population studies, is crucial. Community studies are enormous investments that are supposed to inform the planning process of the Jewish community for the future. They direct significant resources that influence the development of new programs and even reshape how a community understands itself. Community organizations, not just synagogues, but federations and men's clubs and women's clubs. Jewish philanthropies spend millions of dollars to best measure their communities, which makes the absence of consistency with respect to Jews of color that much more concerning and urgent. It seems to me to be vital that research in our community studies adequately and consistently account for all Jews and all Jewish households. We want to help leaders avoid making significant decisions based on inaccurate data. And we want accurate and excellent data because, to be frank, we rely on that data to inform who we serve and how we do the work, the best work for our community. So, for example, if our day school or our synagogue or our yeshiva or our Jewish nonprofit is filled with almost exclusively white colleagues, students, and leaders, and as we now know, at a minimum, 1 in every 10 should be a Jew of color, there's a clear lack of alignment between who is engaged in our Jewish organizations and the true racial diversity of our Jewish community. To be certain that who we see and count in our Jewish community includes the full range of who we know is in our Jewish community, it seems to me that it's probably time that we need to make some changes. This last research provides us with data and learnings and recommendations about what we know and what we don't know, and how to develop better informed sense of creating a better survey for finding out who exactly is part of our Jewish community. A friend of mine, if I could go on for a couple of minutes, a friend of mine that I spoke with a group of Israelis studying for master's degrees in American Jewish Studies at Haifa University. They came to the United States on a 2-week tour, and Washington, D.C., where this friend of mine is based, was one of their final stops before heading back to Israel. And as my friend met with this group and was describing sort of the contours of the American Jewish landscape, he said something in passing about Jews of color. And one of the Israelis interrupted him, and he said, "All we've been hearing about on our trip is Jews of color. I'm a Mizrahi, a Jew of Middle Eastern or African descent, North African descent. Am I a Jew of color?" It's not surprising that this expression felt foreign to these Israeli students. While Jews of color is not an exclusively American term, it was born of this country's complex interrelationship between race and identity. It highlights both the usefulness and the limitation, as well as their power. And as it's understood, or as we have an understanding of race and diversity, and as that understanding of race and diversity continues to evolve, the term Jews of color continues to evolve as well, reflecting our Jewish community's reckoning with race and our own racial blind spots. Lewis Gordon is a professor of philosophy at the University of Connecticut, and he's the founder of the Afro-Jewish Center for Afro-Jewish Studies at Temple University. And he said that he first heard the term in the late 1980s and early 1990s. It was an extension of people of color then being used to build coalitions between different marginalized groups. More specifically, it was a way to see beyond the sort of binary of Ashkenazi Jew. Ashkenazi Jew, if you're not familiar with the term, are Jews who come from Central and Eastern Europe. And Sephardi Jews whose families originated in the Iberian Peninsula when discussing Jewish identity. An umbrella term, this term, Jews of color, encompassed Jews with family origins in African, Asian, and Latin American countries, or those who identified as Black, as Latino, as Asian, as indigenous, or of mixed heritage. Sometimes Sephardi or Mizrahi Jews were included. Sometimes, as I mentioned to you earlier, they were not. And even those who considered themselves Jews of color were sometimes surprised by how many other Jews identified in the same way. In 1997, when Gordon was a professor at Brown University, he remembers being asked to serve as a faculty advisor for a Jews of color club. He said he expected 35 people or so to show up. Instead, he walked into the room and there were over 300 students sitting there waiting for him. A trend developed, and communities for multiracial Jews and families began to form nationwide. Groups such as the Jewish Multiracial Network, on the East Coast or B'chol Lashon in California. These organizations have been met with great enthusiasm. The term Jews of color, just so we're clear that it's not a term that I made up, the term Jews of color really came into its own in the year 2001, when Bridges, a journal for Jewish feminists and our friends, published an issue titled Writing and Art by and for Jewish Women of Color, featuring submissions by Jewish women of African, Asian, Latino, and Native American heritage. That's where the term Jews of color began. It's been around for 21 years now. In the issue's introduction, the editor advocated for the term Jews of color to be widely adopted. Using it, she wrote, can be a political act, as well as an act for people to tell their stories and to think critically about identity and have conversations about things like the personal and political significance of labeling oneself and being labeled. As with all questions surrounding Jewish identity, whether one identifies as a Jew of color is complicated, as I mentioned earlier. It depends in part on how one views oneself and how one is viewed by others. It also is influenced by geography. It's influenced by generation. It's influenced by socioeconomic status. It's influenced by denomination of Judaism and by the kind of relationship that you might have with Judaism in the first place. It's also possible for a Jew to be perceived as white in the wider world, but as a Jew of color in the Jewish community, and vice versa. It's not uncommon, even for Jews of the same family, to identify differently. Jews of color is a really broad term. It has porous boundaries, and that's part of the power and also part of the challenge that term poses. For Mizrahi Jews, Eastern Jews, these challenges can be especially acute. Iranian American Jews are often classified as white, but when it comes to moments in life, someone can label them very differently from what a form says that they are. They could identify as something completely different. That's why we use the term Jews of color. It gives people space to be able to enlarge the scope of not only how they see themselves, but how they see other people as well within the Jewish community. So I want to just give you one other sense of what this is all about. And that is to say that there is a surge of identity politics, both in the United States and in Europe and in Africa and in South America. And there is pretty vigorous debate about the place of the Jewish community within the racial identity sociological construct. And if you look at these discussions, a frequent hot topic is whether or not Jews are slash should be classified as white. There's lots of articles that you can find, numerous op-eds, a variety of studies and books that are now devoted to this particular issue. Some people, some Jews, insist there are white Jews, while others contend all Jews are people of color, not white or of European ancestry, including ones with recent European heritage or ethnically Caucasian converts to Judaism. As someone considered a person of color by this definition, regardless of Jewishness, it seems to me that the truth actually lies somewhere in between these polar opposite ideas. I personally understand why some Jews claim that using the term white Jews acknowledges internal communal intolerance. Although nowhere in Jewish texts and nowhere in Jewish tradition was it ever suggested that people with fair skin are superior. Jewish society is not immune to the disease of colorism. Our community exists in a world where anyone with a darker skin tone might be marginalized. Jews who have African, Middle Eastern, Latino, Asian heritage face discrimination and underrepresentation in Jewish life. For many, calling Jews with pale skin white acknowledges the disparities that we face. However, the term white Jew often is divisively used to scapegoat Jews for white supremacy, not to talk about inequalities within our community. Anti-Semites seek to align Jews with the very ideology that seems to massacre us. The term has also been co-opted by anti-Israel advocates who associate Jews with whiteness to deny our historical connection to Israel. They attempt to vilify and reestablish Jewish state as white and therefore an illegitimate colonial entity. Given how anti-Semites exploit that identification, I can understand why some Jews are going to reject whiteness. In a recent Pew study, 94% of American Jews chose to identify as white. While we're a minority with a long history of persecution by racists for not being viewed as white, Jews themselves do not self-identify as other. They accept whiteness, but we accept whiteness on our own terms. But race is not just about skin tone. People of color come in all shades. Many of us pass as Caucasian, just as people of color with fair skin do not fully enjoy white privilege. Neither do Jews fully enjoy recent European descent. As soon as you are identified as a Jew, you are not a member of a white society. And when you're not a member of a white society, you oftentimes will become a target. Notwithstanding this, to assert Ashkenazi Jews face the same challenges as Mizrahim or Beta Israel or Kaifeng Jews, people of color, I think that's inaccurate. it's also often tainted with colorism. Tellingly, those who claim all Jews are people of color fully accept the blackness of Beta Israel and Black Jews, but then police how lighter-skinned Mizrahim identify. Regardless of how pale someone might be, as someone from the Middle East, they still get stopped at airports in the United States and Europe. They're still observed suspiciously for their features and interrogated about the origin of their name and their accent. American Ashkenazi Jews don't normally face this the same way, even if they were born and they were victimized by anti-Semitism. When people argue that they must drop the term Jews of color, they're really asking people to disregard the diversity that's found in the Jewish community. I think by doing that, it's insulting, and I think it's insulting to lived experience. Mizrahi Jews, Middle Eastern Jews are fighting for a society where all Jews are treated equally, but they're not living in it. Erasing that truth only keeps them locked in the cycle of oppression. As for those who are anti-Semites, who weaponize Jewish diversity to attack Israel, indigeneity does not depend on race. Your skin color doesn't determine the origin of your ancestors. Ashkenazi Jews are just as indigenous to the land of Israel as Ethiopian Jews. Branding Jewish people as uniquely responsible for the oppressive heritage of whiteness speaks to racism. Jews must be able, I think, to define ourselves without others overriding that. And that's why I myself will never tell a Jew how to identify. I find it preposterous that some will do that to other Jews. There's much, much more that I could talk about tonight in terms of Jewish whiteness and Jews of color and racism, but I'd love to be able to take any questions if you have any, or any comments that you might have about some of the remarks that we've made this evening.
Anybody wants to make a comment, please unmute yourself. If you would, you can show your video or not, it's up to you.
Any questions?
I'll say something.
Okay.
Growing up, I was always told there were Jews all over the world in different countries, and from Africa to China. So I just never thought of separating Jews. I knew there were Jews that weren't white. I don't know how that affected me in the long run, but I never thought of categorizing them as Jews of color.
I mean, it's interesting that you knew that there were Jews that were not white, because to be honest, when I was growing up as a kid, I never thought about Jews being other than white. I mean, I used to have a teacher in Hebrew school who came from Shanghai. His family had escaped and went to China, and but he was white. So it seemed to me that all Jews were white. it never dawned on me till much, much later in my life that there were Jews of color. It was especially a prominent feature to me when I went and I lived in Israel. I mean, that's when I really became aware of the disparity between white Jews and Jews of color.
Yeah.
Because in Israel, I mean, it's not so much so today, but when I was living in Israel in the 70s, there was a huge disparity between Mizrahim and Ashkenazim, the Ashkenazic Jews who came from Europe and the Mizrahim Jews who came from Eastern
Well, I know
countries.
my parents were very liberal, and I think some of you know that my father was a Jew by choice, and one of his nephews referred to my mother, that he accepted my mother because she was a white Jew. And I had never heard that term. My mother told me this story. And so that was an acceptable term by non-Jews to say, well, you're okay. I don't know. He accepted her because he said she was a white Jew.
Mhm. Okay.
And
Hold your hand up.
I have a question. I can't get on the video, but I have a question.
Okay.
And I'm wondering, Jews of color, first of all, unlike Suzanne, I had no idea that there were anything but white Jews. I was never aware of that growing up.
I didn't live with them.
No. I mean, I didn't know they existed. But my question is about those who are living in the United States, and that is, do they fundamentally live? I hear something else.
Yeah, I can't. If other people could mute themselves, that would be great.
I'm wondering where they live predominantly. Are they in large urban areas?
Wait.
And along with my question is about those who are living in the United States, and that is, do they? I'm sorry, I can't compete. I hear something else.
I can't really make out the question.
Okay, should I go on?
Yes, now you can go on.
Okay, so my question deals with whether or not they live in large urban areas because of the possibility of there being more of them there rather than in smaller areas like where we live. And the other question is, are they, according to census and so forth, are they practicing Jews? Do they have synagogues of their own? Are they incorporated into the larger Jewish community and belong to those synagogues? And so it's in the practicing area that I'm curious.
All of the above that you've mentioned are true. You're talking about Jews of color.
That's what that's how I started it. Yes.
Yeah. So predominantly Jews of color live in urban areas.
That's what I thought.
They live in urban areas for a couple of reasons. One reason is because there's a larger Jewish community there. The second reason is because there are synagogues available in larger urban communities where they're not necessarily available in smaller communities. And third, they generally find like-minded Jews or other Jews of color in those areas. Now, when you ask, do they worship in their own synagogues? There are some who have their own synagogues. There is for example, there's a pretty famous black synagogue that's in Boston, which is predominantly African American and African native African individuals. There's a synagogue in Connecticut that that they rent space to a Black Jewish community where they have their own services. So what I'm saying is that there are enough of them to create their own community. There are some synagogues that simply invite them to become part of their synagogue, and they become part of the synagogue. But where they're looking for a specific identity or a specific identification, they tend to connect with their own through their own individual synagogues. And most of the vast majority of them come from Orthodox backgrounds, and yet they no longer practice Orthodox Judaism. They tend to practice either conservative Judaism or Reform Judaism nowadays.
Paula's had her hand up a long time.
Oh, thank you. So I unmuted myself. I have a couple of comments and then a couple of questions. First of all, I wanted to say that my understanding is, and I think I am correct, that in the American census, your race is self-identified. It is not a census taker or anybody else who assigns your race. You do it yourself. Second, Rabbi, I was surprised that you didn't mention the Philashes. My understanding is that after the airlift of the Ethiopian Jews, a large majority, I think it's fair to say, of Philashes had terrible times with discrimination in Israel. And I was wondering about your comment on that and the role of race in the Israeli society.
They
were put in camps and treated pretty bad.
Oh yeah, they've had a terrible. They had terrible times going to Israel. I mean, even though Israel came in and airlifted them out, they had terrible times on a lot of different levels, sociologically, religiously. The Orthodox rabbinate wouldn't accept them as Jews for a long period
Right.
of time. In fact, if you've read the paper over the last few weeks, the rabbi who's the chief Ashkenazi rabbi in Israel, Lau, he has threatened to declare all of the Ethiopian Jews not Jewish if they don't. There's a movement now to change the conversion standards in Israel, where anybody can be accepted. Any rabbi's standard can be accepted. It doesn't have to be an Orthodox standard of conversion. So he has threatened to basically disown the Ethiopian population and call them non-Jews.
Which is a big message.
Excuse me?
I'm saying, which is a big message for
It's a
Jews
terrible.
around the world.
It's a terrible message. It's a terrible
there's
message
a large
to send to
Jewish
the world.
community in India, and
Right.
They consider themselves members of the House of Benjamin, and
I mean,
they wouldn't take kindly either.
It's an awful message. It's an awful message to send to the world, and I mean the dehumanization of what that would do to this community would be I think something that they would never recover from. You know, being accepted as Jew. I mean, it's like I envision it as like a ping pong ball going back and forth. Yes, you're Jewish today. No, you're Jewish. You're not Jewish tomorrow. Yes, you're Jewish today. No, you're not Jewish. I mean, you can't do that with people's lives. I mean, they fought in Israel to become recognized as Jews. Yes, they all had to be recircumcised, even though they had already been circumcised. They forced them to be recircumcised, which they all did as a community. And then they were finally accepted. They were finally accepted as Jews. And now he's threatening to disown them as being part of the Jewish community, from the Jewish community. It's terrible.
If I may, the other thing I wanted to mention was our temple in Baltimore, Chizuk Emunah, has a number of Black members. I was bat mitzvahed with one as an adult, and there was not a question of differentness. I mean, she was who she is. Being Black is part of her identity. There is an issue there now of Blacks in the congregation resenting being treated as guests because people assume that they are not Jewish. And it's people trying to be helpful.
So they're
and yet
stereotyping
inadvertently.
them. They're
So the one
stereotyping.
thing I wanted to ask you is, what are the demands, if that's not too strong a word, of Jews of color in terms of what they are looking for in their colored Jewishness?
They're basically looking for parity with Jews who are white, with Ashkenazi Jews, to be given the same identification, the same privilege. In other words, that color should not be looked upon. Color should not be immediately determined as a barrier.
So by whom?
By anyone in that community, by anyone
in the Jewish community,
in the Jewish community.
So it's basically what I'm talking about with Chizuk Emunah, that the Ashkenazi community does not recognize Jews of color as Jewish as readily as they should.
Right, as readily as they should. I don't think I could put it better than that. Yes, they don't recognize
not ceremonies or with. Okay, thank you.
No, not at all. They have the exact same ceremonies. They have the exact same prayers. They say the Shema the same way that we do. They have the same melodies that everybody else does. I mean, some of the ancient melodies, when we sing the Kaddish or the Chatzi Kaddish, they sing it the exact same way. You know, it's no different, none whatsoever. The only difference is the way that they look, is the way that they appear.
Thank you.
And that's looked upon oftentimes with askance, unfortunately.
But don't they not exactly think we Reform Jews are Jews also?
Excuse me?
In Israel. Don't they have, doesn't the Orthodox community have the attitude that we Reform Jews might not be actual Jews either?
Yes, they have the idea that Reform rabbis are clowns, and they pervert what Jewishness and what Judaism is supposed to, how Judaism is supposed to be portrayed in people's lives.
Isn't that changing though?
It's the same problem. It's the same problem with Reform Jews, and to be honest, with conservative Jews in Israel, exact same problem. Yep.
Fran and Michael have had their hand up for a long time.
Bonnie did too.
Isn't that changing?
Fran?
Yes, thank you. We belong to a congregation, past tense, in Scranton, Pennsylvania. It's a small congregation with a beautiful big building. And after a while, a Black woman with a small child would come regularly. And the kid's name was Brooklyn. And she was beginning to do the Kiddush. The child was reciting the Kiddush. And I thought, wow, I never thought of Black Jews, except when I was in Israel during the Ethiopian airlift. There was a bunch of them, and the Israelis just made them sit in the back of the bus kind of philosophy. They were really ostracized for many reasons, but because they were Black. And so this whole concept is very new. And even though the congregation up in Pennsylvania was very liberal, I mean, we had LBGD meetings and, you know, all that, whatever's current. She was alone. I think I was the only one who ever spoke to her.
Really?
So
it seems to be an aberration. When you meet,
no one in the community.
They did eventually, but it took a while because they seem to be an aberration because it's such a stark difference between the Black. She was very dark. She was obviously Black. But of course, most of us grew up knowing one Black Jew, and that was a Jew of choice. That's Sammy Davis Jr. Right. And there were a lot of stories and a lot of jokes about him. But he was serious about his Judaism, I believe, and he was sort of a spokesperson in the small influence that he could have on people. But I mean, it's definitely, for most of us, I think, it was an aberration. And I know in New York, the term for blacks was schwarzer.
Right.
Our parents used it. They did not like other terms, and they didn't use it in a mean fashion. It was just a descriptor. The person who cleaned your house was a schwarzer. That didn't say that she was a bad person, but it was also understood that you didn't socialize with them, and you
Right.
don't dare bring home one on a date, that type of thing. So, have we come far from that?
We've come.
Maybe.
Yeah,
I hope
made,
we have, but I don't know.
In some places, but not all over.
You know, I think we've made tremendous strides within the Jewish community as to you know, the acceptance of Jews of color. I know in Israel, especially with the Mizrahim, who at one time were as badly rejected as the Ethiopian Jews. I mean, now the Mizrahim have their own political parties. They have members in Knesset. So they've gained a foothold within Israeli society, and there's a greater degree of acceptance of Mizrahim than there ever was before. It's just that, you know, now when this Rabbi Lau he's using, you know, the Ethiopian community as for political pressure, I think all it does is divide up what the Jewish community is supposed to be all about.
Well, Rabbi, if you say they have their own political party, they're separating themselves in a way.
When I say they have their own political party, they have a party that is made up of Mizrahim who vote together as a bloc, you know, for the rights of Mizrahim in Israel. I wouldn't say that they separate themselves. It's like any other political party in Israel. They come together and they argue and they fight for whatever causes they feel are just or what's humane or what is justified, and they wield their own power as a voting bloc. And in the Knesset, the Labor Party, the Likud Party, they try and win the Mizrahim over to their side so as to get votes to make a majority government.
So when I was growing up, I knew one black person my age, but he wasn't totally black. He was mixed race. His father was black, his mother was white and Jewish, and so he was Jewish. He came to Sunday school. They belonged to our temple. But I wonder how many people now. I had a very good friend. She and her husband adopted 2 children. One, both mixed race. One was white and black. The other one was Mexican and Indian. And those are their children. And they went to Hebrew school in Connecticut, in Mansfield, as a matter of fact. But there are a lot of Black Jews that are mixed race. A lot that have been adopted.
Yep, and they've ultimately become converted to Judaism. I had
Right.
2 students like that in my former congregation where they were of mixed race. Both of them, one of them was adopted, and one was a mixed race child as a product of that marriage. And we converted them to Judaism, and they became Jews. They became B'nai Mitzvah. They were confirmed as Jews and accepted completely as Jews in the community. Did they look different? Sure. Yes, they did look different. But I think that's part of the point of what I was saying before, is that all Jews don't look alike. You know, they don't look alike. There are Jews that look different than you and I. Whether
And
it's darker,
I didn't grow up far from where you grew up. I grew up in Stamford, but I was never allowed to use derogatory terms. But I never even heard cushy.
you never heard
I
Cushy?
never did.
Never.
Oh.
And Schwarza, I thought I was so upset when I found out that my great-grandparents used to use that term. I was really upset because I
Everybody use that term.
was brought up that you just don't do that. It's not nice. It was considered derogatory. Unlike Michael says, oh, it's just a way of identifying. It was more than identifying.
I can't read that.
I remember being punished for using that term.
Yeah.
You're unmuted.
Yeah,
Well,
my parents would not accept that term at all. I never heard them use it. I had heard my
Right.
friends use it, and I mistakenly, only once, I mistakenly used the term. Never again did I.
It only takes one time.
Shelley has her hand up.
Shelley has her hand up, please.
Never again.
Go ahead, Shelley.
I had a
Are there
question.
any black,
Let's do one at a time. Let's do one at a
Shelley-
time, folks.
Shelley's
Let's do one at a
speaking.
time. Shelley's speaking now.
Thank you. I had a question about the term falasha. My understanding was that it is also a derogatory term,
Yeah.
not a descriptor of Ethiopians that they want used about them. Is that correct?
It is a derogatory term.
Okay.
Yes. Yes. And in fact, they don't refer to them as Falashan Jews any longer. They simply refer to them as the Black Jewish community or the Ethiopian Jewish community, but they don't. The term is not really used publicly any. I mean, there are people that still use it, I suppose, but
Yeah.
it's not. You won't find it in the press anymore.
It's not politically correct.
Right. It's
Okay,
not.
folks, there's three people. Look at your screen. See all the hands up? Okay, I'm going to call on them one at a time. Otherwise, everybody's going to be trying to talk over everybody else. I think Gusty wanted to speak just after Suzanne did. So Gusty, then Kathy Silver, who hasn't spoken yet, and then or Mike, and then Michael Krakow, and then Mike Himowitz. Okay, let's do it that way.
Well, I was looking at the urban generation of our children. And in New York, for example, where my grandchildren live, everybody's marrying everybody. And there isn't going to, well, I don't know, I'm hoping there isn't going to be a clear line between black and not black and white anymore.
Or between Jewish and non-Jewish anymore.
Yeah,
right. Those lines have been I won't say permanently broken, but they're being trampled on by this generation that's marrying, this current generation that's marrying more so than any other generation.
Right, Kathy, do you have something?
Dick, it's Scott. Can you enable
Scott,
our
okay.
video? Can you enable our video, please? It says the host has disabled the video.
Okay, I just asked you to start your video.
There we go.
Okay.
Here I am.
Okay.
Hello, everybody.
Okay.
So we're talking tonight about white Jews, but I had a very interesting experience as a teenager. I was at a Reformed Jewish camp. I believe it was called Joseph and Betty Harlem Camp in Creskyville, Pennsylvania.
Pennsylvania.
Yes. And I was a counselor, and I met a very young rabbi who was from Japan. And he did not look Jewish. He was a non-white Asian rabbi who taught me the Japanese game called Go, or Go Moku, which is much older than the ancient game of chess.
Did he become a rabbi in Japan, or did he become a rabbi here in the United States?
I think he was a rabbi in Japan.
Oh, okay.
I think. I don't remember. It was a long...
I mean, there are rabbinic seminaries in Japan.
Yes. But he was
not
a
many, but
charming, he was a charming, wonderful man. We had a wonderful relationship. We had a number of discussions about religion and different cultures, and I learned the game of Go. And it was just a terrific experience and very eye-opening for me.
All right, I know, did Mike Himowitz have something he wanted to say? Mike?
Yeah, going back to the use of derogatory terms. I'm on, yeah. In my family, unfortunately, the use of the term Schwarze to refer to Black people was not uncommon, heard from generations older than mine. But that also brings up the question of self-identification and what a name means in some contexts and not in others. For example, when the Jew called the word Schwarze, that comes from the German actually, Schwarz, which means black. That's all it means.
Black. Right.
And so it's used derogatorily when Jews use it. However, there was a time when the Negroes said, we don't want to be called Negros anymore. We want to be called blacks. And then blacks decided that they didn't want to be called blacks anymore. They wanted to be called African Americans. And then the African Americans have once again decided that it's okay to be called black as long as you capitalize it. So really, the question is not one of the question is how you intend it, even though the words may be exactly the same, and how one group can change what it wants to be called 3 times within my lifetime. The other thing is that an interesting thing I found out is I worked for a newspaper and I covered several censuses, which were always big news, but it was in the 2000 census that I think they first allowed a multi-race category. And this just threw off the census people like crazy because they only had to deal with like 6 racial groups before. And now all of a sudden you could mix and match and you could have up to 5 of them. So we were in Maryland, where I worked for the Baltimore Sun, where there's a very large black population. Those of us who covered this were thinking, oh, this is going to drive us crazy because there's such a large black population. They're just going to fragment themselves, and we're going to have this incredible problem reporting on it. Well, as it turns out, 95% of the black population in Maryland described itself as black, even though many of them were in fact multiracial. Mm. In other states, a much larger percentage of people who we would call black decided that they would call themselves multiracial, and some had 2 or 3 races. So it's what people call themselves and what other people call them and why they call them that. It's really important, I think.
Batya Henderson, you had something? Batya?
Yes, Batya.
Batya.
Go ahead.
Well, I don't know why I'm not.
We see you.
We see you and we hear you.
Okay. Rabbi and people, hello. I'd like to understand one thing. Jewish of color, people of color. So when you say that, are we referring only to black? Because I am not white. I am olive. My skin is olive. As far as I know, the great majority of people in Israel are olive, brown. In Brazil, the same thing. And also, white is a color, or isn't? Or it isn't. I think white is a color also. So maybe it should be people features, different features, because we have people, Jewish that come from Russia, and in the past we called them red. And people from Asia, China, etc., we called them yellow. So we had black, white, yellow, and red. And then now we have a very high diversification. That's okay, I agree with it. But, you know, I have a very big or high difficulty when I fill up a form in a doctor, in a job, or anywhere and say, what is your race? And it says, white Caucasian. I'm not white Caucasian. My husband is, because he is blonde, blue eyes, and very, very white skin. I am olive, as somebody said, because I came from Iberic Peninsula, my ancestrality, some from Italy, Greece, and Middle East. Jewish from Morocco, they are olive and brown. So I'd like to understand these people of color. Do they refer only to black or to the diversity?
No, they refer to the diversity, not only to black.
Oh, okay.
No,
okay.
no, when we talk about Jews of color, we're talking about a whole variety of colors and ethnic backgrounds of these individuals.
Okay.
I personally
Michael?
like the other
Hold on a
choice.
second, Suzanne. Michael?
Yeah, Fran, and I have to
Fran.
comment also. Go ahead,
I
Fran.
just wanted to know, are there any black rabbis for these black congregations?
There are, yes, not many, but there are black rabbis there. I mean, I know of 2 or 3 Reform black rabbis here in the United States. I know of 2 that are functioning in Israel. I can't speak about anywhere else around the world, but those individuals I know of. I mean, I knew one in West Hartford, Connecticut, who he actually lived in Massachusetts, but the community was in the West Hartford surrounding area. So he would come down and do services once a month at a synagogue, Temple Emmanuel, in West Hartford, where they would lease space for Shabbat morning services once a month.
Right.
So yes. So the answer to your question is yes. There are black rabbis.
Michael, you got something?
Interesting. Hello.
Go ahead.
An interesting anecdote. I had a client. I think you all know that my professional career is spent in dentistry, but I also had a short stint in the mortgage business. And I had a client who was white, Jewish, and South African. And when he had to fill out an application, he would have put himself down as an African American. A totally accurate statement, but totally meaningless in the common
context
modern
of what we think
context.
of as.
He always got a kick out of that, and I did too when he shared that with me.
That's funny.
Yeah.
Okay. Anybody else have a comment? If not, I think we'll probably adjourn for tonight.
Right,
Rabbi, what's our topic for February?
The topic for February is Jewish gangsters.
Okay.
Gangsters, Jewish
I think
criminals.
we'll have a bigger audience.
One thing I will mention to you is, if you would like, I did not bring it up tonight, but there is a book that you might be interested in reading if you really want to understand the origin of the Jewish community. There's a book called the Kuzari. It's about the story of the Khazars, which is where the original Jewish community we think emanated from. The Kuzari was written by the Jewish philosopher Judah Halevi, but it's been updated into modern English and gives you a really good it gives you some good insight into how we need to look at the Jewish community as a diverse kind of a community rather than as a as a unified sort of one kind of community. So I'll if you want, I'll send it to Dick, and he can put it into the newsletter, and you can take the book out of the library and even just skim it. But you get a sense of the real origin of where Jews, we quote Jews, come from in the world today. And it's not the Bible.
I have a recommendation of a book.
Hold on a second. Scott has.
I don't know how to.
Well, put your screen, put your video on and raise your hands.
I can't. You've got me on. You've got me on video,
go ahead.
I don't know how to raise the hand on the screen.
Okay, go ahead now. I asked you to start your video.
You can start it now.
Yep.
Okay. Well, it won't start. It won't start. But I have.
There you are. Okay, there you are.
There you go. Hello. There's a book that we did at the Jewish Book Festival last year that some of you may be interested in. It's called The Red Sea Spies. And, and it's a book about how the African community, I think it was Ethiopia, they were very oppressed, and how a group of Israelis got together and were able to have them rescued out of Africa. And it's really, it's a true story, about how they brought them from there to the Red Sea and then over into Israel.
It was a great book, and they made a movie out of it called The Red Sea Diving Resort. And the movie is just as compelling as the book.
Scott Silver?
No, I have nothing.
Oh, your hand's still up. Okay.
Oh, sorry. No.
How do you put your hand up like that?
No, that was
at the bottom of your screen.
It was clapping, not my hand up.
Where does it say?
There's something that says reactions.
In reactions?
Yeah,
reaction. The last category, reactions.
Oh, look at that.
You click that on it. You can put all kinds of emojis and anything you want on there.
Gotcha. Thank you.
All right, folks.
Is this, you know how they always say that Sunday morning is the most segregated time of the week in America. And what we're learning tonight is so is Shabbos, that we're not any better. Is that right?
Well, no, but if I ever teach you a class, which I probably should do, in Reform Judaism, one of the things that you will see is that when Reform Judaism first came to bear in Germany in the mid 1800s, one of the ways that they broke away from Orthodox Judaism was they had their Shabbat services on Sunday morning with everybody else, where everybody was going to a place of worship together, Jews, Christians, and that happened. Actually, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the temple in Atlanta. The temple in Atlanta is one of 5 synagogues in the United States that they have Friday night services and Saturday services, but because of their ties to Germanic reform, they still hold a Sunday morning service.
Interesting.
They still have a Sunday morning service. You can still go to services there on Sunday morning, as you can, and one in San Francisco, and there's one in Texas, and there's one in Illinois, and there's one in, I think the last one is in Washington State. I think that's the 5th one. There's still five synagogues that you can still go to Sunday morning services.
Okay.
Is a black rabbi acceptable in a white congregation and vice versa to conduct services?
Yes, absolutely.
It does happen.
Yes, the same as a gay rabbi would be acceptable in a heterosexual congregation.
Good for us.
That a synagogue that does not have a particularly sexual orientation. A heterosexual rabbi can be found in a gay synagogue, and a gay rabbi can be found in a heterosexual synagogue. Yes, they are acceptable.
Are there Black Jews in Collier County that we should be reaching out to?
I don't know. I can find out, but I honestly don't know. There is a Black Jew, a very small Black Jewish community in Miami. I don't know if there's one in Tampa. I'm not sure. I'd have to research that, but there is one in Miami. We should try to get. I mean, if you would like to hear a Jew of color speak at a Friday night service, I'm more than happy to invite one to come. And if you would find
that'd be nice.
Find it fascinating. I'll certainly endeavor to bring someone in who will, who might be able to answer more questions that you have about this.
That's a good idea.
Is that something you would like to?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
All right.
And he's
I'll work on
probably
it.
experienced discrimination from both fronts throughout his
Nice
life
to,
or her life.
great presentation, Rabbi. Thank you. And a
Thank you.
wonderful
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think we're going to end the meeting at this point, folks. We'll
Okay.
see you all this Friday night on Zoom and YouTube if you so choose. Rabbi
Okay.
will be leading services.
Thank you, Dick.
Thank you, Rabbi.